Good evening to all of you. Welcome, welcome.
Oh, that light is very bright.
I think we're going to get started. My name is Deborah Schwartz. I'm the president of the Brooklyn Historical Society, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I'd just like to get a sense of how many of you are here for the first time. Can I see a show of hands? Woohoo. Wonderful. Welcome, welcome. We're delighted you're here. We hope you'll come back often. On your way out, please make sure you pick up some of the information about our programs, which are plentiful in this space, night after night, all kinds of interesting programs, and we hope you'll come back and visit. I want to start by, before I introduce our guests tonight, by telling you a little bit about the overarching Muslims in Brooklyn project that this panel is part of, so that you have a sense of the larger context. This is a project we've been working on for now 3 years. I am here introducing this program in large part because my much beloved colleague Zahir Ali, who is our oral historian at the Brooklyn Historical Society, is not able to be here. He had an accident that he is recovering from. We miss him terribly. So it's my job to try to represent the amazing vision and work that Zahir has created, which in its essence started out actually as a core group of oral histories that were taken over 50 oral histories, over 90 hours of audio, which are basically the first-hand memories from narrators born as early as 1944 and from places all over the world, but who now call Brooklyn home. That oral history collection, which is now part of our collections at the Brooklyn Historical Society, is available to you online, but it is also the springboard for us of lots of other parts of our work, including a curriculum for schools, which will be launched in November, as well as lots and lots of programming efforts. There have been listening sessions all over the city that have been rich and wonderful and engaging. And in addition to that, it has been our real pleasure to be a partner with BRIC. It is not the first time that we've partnered with BRIC on projects, but it certainly is one of the most rewarding, and I want to personally thank Elizabeth Ferrer, who is in the audience with us, the chief curator at BRIC. Elizabeth, thank you for being here. When we do projects, we are always looking for opportunities to, in essence, expand beyond the walls of this beautiful building. And so as we began to formulate some of our ideas for this project, we started a conversation with Elizabeth, and it quickly turned into the exhibition that you're going to hear from some of the artists about tonight. And in addition to that, and of course, as a central piece of this, is our exhibition here, an opening by Kameelah Janan Rasheed, who is one of our panelists as well. And so all of this relationship between history, oral history, and the arts has been a really exciting part of this project. A few other thanks and acknowledgments that I want to make tonight, because a project like this is ambitious and takes a lot of support. So I want to highlight a few of our amazing funders who have been very generous. In particular, I want to thank the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Arts Building Bridges program, and Linda Artola is here with us tonight. Linda, welcome. Thank you for being here. Others I want to just note are the Ford Foundation, the New York Community Trust, the Pillars Fund, the Pop Culture Collaborative, and a number of very generous supporters in the City Council, with Brad Lander being a particular supporter. He actually has a community, a very expansive community of Bangladeshi neighbors in his City Council district, and they have also become great friends of this project. A few other things that I just want to mention, one of which is that there is a catalog for BRIC's show available in the back there. There may be enough for everybody, and if they're not, it's just your good excuse to go over to BRIC and see the magnificent exhibition that's there. I also wanted to mention before I introduce Sara Raza, who will be moderating tonight, that Kameelah's show here, which is just one of my favorite things we've ever actually mounted in this institution, is a very complex and subtle installation that includes visual art and sound. And because of that, we have a staff who stays outside the exhibition all the time, helping us to give people headphones so that they can experience the exhibition fully. And we are looking for volunteers to help with that process. If you're interested at all, please see our visitor services staff. We would love to have you join our group. We need people who can give a few hours a week, and it's an enormous help to us. I think with that, I'm going to turn to my formal introduction of Sara. Sara Raza is a curator and writer on global art and was the winner of the Art Table New Leadership Award for Women in the Arts in 2016. She was most recently the Guggenheim UBS map curator for the Middle East and the North Africa, and curated But a Storm is Blowing from Paradise at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. She's curated exhibitions and projects for several international biennials, festivals, and museums. Recently, the Mathaf Arab Modern Art Museum in Doha, Qatar, at the Mackenzie Art Gallery. The list goes on. And she is the first guest curator for the Rubin Museum of Art's Year of Power and organized the exhibition Clapping with Stones, which is on view through January of 2020. Sara also runs her own independent global curatorial and visual cultures studio practice, Punk Orientalism, and is currently completing a book on her research on Soviet Orientalism. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Sara, who will introduce the rest of our guests. Welcome and enjoy the show.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for that very kind and warm welcome. Good evening to you all. It's so nice to see so many fresh faces here this evening. And I'm delighted to join you all with my panelists here. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce, starting with Baseera Khan to my right here. Baseera is a Brooklyn-based artist born in Denton, Texas. And she draws from a variety of different angles within her practice, mainly the personal and the collective experience of being both Muslim and American. I like to call her dual informant. And very much thinking about an amalgamation of ideas, visual cultural ideas, photography, fashion, language, textile, music, sculpture, to name a few, to explore ideas around alienation and displacement. Welcome, and thank you, Baseera. To Baseera's right, we have Kameelah Janan Rasheed, whose installation and opening is on view here at the Brooklyn Historical Society. Kameelah is both a self-confessed learner and interdisciplinary artist who seeks to expand her practice through an ideas-driven narrative, through thinking about various ideas, thought experiments, if you like. And her projects take on multiple sort of roles in society and art, thinking about the role of the library, the archive, using poetry, literature, and other forms as well. She has both exhibited nationally and internationally. She has showcased her work throughout the United States, as well as at the 2017 Venice Biennale, the Pinchuk Art Center, which is in Kiev, Ukraine, where she was also shortlisted for the Future Generation Prize. And it's a pleasure to be joined with Kameelah. And also, last but not least, we have Asif Mian. I think you're outnumbered tonight, the only man on our panel, usually the other way around. So welcome, Asif. He is an emerging artist who recently graduated with his MFA from Columbia University and holds a BA in studio art and biology from Drew University. And recent exhibitions he has undertaken at the Queen's Museum's Always Already Haunting, Disco Haunt, curated by the Whitney ISP Fellows at the Kitchen, as well as others, including The Shed most recently as part of a specific project. And his work is showing alongside Baseera's at BRIC and Beyond Geographies. So I urge you all to go and have a look if you haven't already had the chance. So thank you and welcome to our panelists this evening. I'd like to just open our discussion today with why I'm here. I'm not an artist, I'm an art historian. I was most recently, as Deborah kindly mentioned, the Guggenheim UBS map curator for Middle East and North Africa. So I was invited to the United States 4.5 years ago to help diversify the Guggenheim's collection with art from the Middle East and North Africa. And as I was compiling my project, one question would often come about with the curators at the Guggenheim, is that why can't you find artists who live in the region? Why are they living and working in Europe? Why are they living and working in the United States? And a question that I often, how I answered this question was, there's something called empire. These artists didn't accidentally end up in Europe, and they didn't accidentally come here to the United States as part of a very complex history of migration. And these artists contribute to our visual culture, our academia, and so forth, and to our sort of wider exhibition-making history. So that was something that I've always sort of grappled with as somebody who is living and working in the diaspora. I'm of Persian, Iranian origin, but I was born in the United Kingdom, as you can tell from my accent. And this has been an ongoing concern about what constitutes as, center and periphery. If we think about artists who are living and working in the United States and Europe, and those who are working in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere, several of these artists speak several languages. They hold dual studios. They have studios in multiple cities. Some of them even hold dual passports. That's something that has always been interesting for me, to think about hybridity, to think about people who speak more than one language, hold more than one culture. And that is definitely a very positive thing to uphold. It's the difference between that and eating the same food every day, right? So there's also this idea of constructing narratives that I've always been interested in, and new narratives that artists allow us to sort of circumvent spaces. And with the case of this particular project, I was invited as a respondent. I'm not the curator of this exhibition. I am responding in terms of my own interest in multiplicity, in fluidity and migrations, and how sort of in-between spaces inform several artist practices. And within the context of today's panel, initially it was problematic to think about an exhibition that's culturally specific around Muslim identity. I've rarely seen an exhibition around Christian art unless it's within the Byzantine context, or Judaic art, Jewish art, for example, as it's been a very particular. I'd just like to sort of demystify one really important point. Islamic art refers to a very particular moment in history. That is between the golden age of Islam, 7th to 13th, 14th centuries, was when Islam was flourishing. All the ideas that we sort of see today, and we understand them through modern continental theory, European theory, have emerged from the sciences of Islamic scholars. Ideas don't fall out the sky. As we all know, they evolve. And the contributions of Muslim scientists is profound. Unfortunately, this isn't always articulated. Common example, the word algebra, it comes from Egypt, it comes from a man who invented this mathematical, or the idea around geometries, again, rooted in Islamic thinking, or even the rotary devices that are in our clock. They are rooted in Islamic sciences from 13th century, from inventors from ancient Mesopotamia. I'm not being nostalgic to say that once upon a time we were the sort of pinnacle of history and science. Muslim philosophers, scientists did rewrite history and text and scientific thinking that was destroyed by the Crusades, destroyed by the ISIS of that time. And they basically destroyed all the books that were written by the Greeks, and Muslims, Arabs, Persians, and others rewrote history. So that's very particular to sort of contextualize that. Fast forward, we're in the 21st century right now. We're not in the birthplace of the Islamic world, we're in the United States. And there are various specific set of complexities that are articulated within these artist practices that they will share this evening with us. And that is something sort of that I wanted to sort of set the tone for our discussion, that we can't really weave in and out of history, but these artists are very much contemporary, but they haven't necessarily cut off the past. They do look to historical ideas that are very much rooted in some cases antiquity also, but they're very much contemporary in their thinking and how they go about their methodologies as artists. So that is something that I wanted to sort of set the stage with, that we really, culturally specific exhibition making is problematic. Problematic in the 21st century, where specifically when we're dealing with artists who are ideas driven, they are thinking about thought, science, and so forth, that we can't really root them or pigeonhole them within a very particular sort of cultural framework. And I think, it is their choice if they choose to sort of take elements, but that is not necessarily what I'm interested in as a curator and a historian, an art historian in particular. And I don't want to speak on behalf of them, but given the nature of their practice, it is much more fluid, much more expanded than that. And I want to sort of get the conversation going with my panelists this evening, and I wanted to start with the project that Kameelah has articulated, which is right here within this specific context of the Brooklyn Historical Society, and how that came about. Could you kindly say a few words about that and your initial sort of maybe perhaps reservation or excitement towards the idea? Thank you.
Hi. Good evening. Thanks for coming out. I think to yeah, I'm actually like sort of processing right now. Some of the slides that I was going to present were sort of thinking about ideas related to perimeters and leakiness and fluidity. And I think there is a certain tendency to flatten narratives and to make sense of worlds through creating legibility by creating categories, then placing identities and histories within those categories. For me, I didn't feel any particular hesitation about the project because I know sort of the intentionality behind my work, and I know sort of how I build community and ecosystems around the work that I do. So it was important to think about this project less as like a definitive notion around what Muslim identity is, and this was more of an exploration of thinking about ideas related to perimeters. There are a couple of things that I wanted to share. There's a chapter that Muslims are encouraged to read every Friday, Surat al-Kahf, it's the 18th chapter, The Cave, and in that chapter there's tons of stories that are happening, but the one story that I constantly refer to or come back to is the story between Musa and Khadir, and you don't have to like believe in any of these things for the sort of the moral or principle of the story to make sense, but they're going on this journey together, and Musa is constantly sort of asking Khadir to like explain what's happening. Khadir's like, chill out, like calm down, like you'll figure out what's happening along the way. Musa really can't be patient, like or Moses, he literally can't hold himself together, and so they get to the end of all these things that are happening, and Khadir explains to him like what this means, and he's like, and now we part ways. And then there's, towards the end of that chapter, there's a verse 109, where it says something to the effect of, if the oceans were words to spell out the words of my Lord, sooner would the oceans be exhausted before the words of my Lord. And so for me, thinking about chapter 18 in the Quran in relation to my practice, I think a lot about sort of the observable universe being very, very small, and then the entire universe being very, very large, and sort of what it means to travel with and through uncertainty, and to be okay with not knowing things, and to be okay with things unfolding over time. So the way that I work in my practice and the way that I work with any archive that I approach is thinking about that archive as an opportunity to sort of get somewhere, but not to get everywhere. And there's an impossibility of that certainty, or an impossibility of knowing everything. And I think as it relates to identity, there's sort of this notion of being okay with the non-completeness, because we are supposed to be evolving as humans, and that if we were to know everything, how unfun would life be? And so in my practice, I really think about learning as sort of a driving force. What does it mean to invite people to learn alongside you? And what does it mean to learn through the creation of work? And what does it mean to revise and redact and to make changes in your practice as you are presenting it to the public?
Thank you very much, Kameelah. And also Baseera, I mean, in terms of framing your work, privacy control, which is site-specific in the exhibition, it's thinking about conceptual partition, but also rooted in Islamic theology. In particular, you take 4 chapters, if you like, from the Quran. Perhaps you can say a few words.
Hi, everybody. Everybody up? Okay. Yes, privacy control, the title itself comes from a material that you see when you're walking around. I don't think I have the image of privacy control because I'm withholding that image specifically because I want you all to walk down to BRIC and see the show. So I purposefully didn't put that in my slideshow. But anyway, so privacy control, it's actually a film material that enables you to have privacy based on whether or not you're standing on the side of light or the side of darkness, right? And so you see this a lot when you're walking around in the city. There's all these buildings with glass everywhere. So I started to notice that material because my family in Denton, Texas is responsible for building out a very large interfaith mosque, basically, with accredited education, and it's been kind of incredible to be a part of that process. But one of the things that I noticed one Friday at prayer was I was sitting with my nieces, and I'm looking through this glass window at the imam saying the khutbah, and then I'm seeing all of that and myself and all of these things at the same time. And I started to wonder wow, every woman in the world sees through this double glass. They see themselves seeing these men see themselves. And so I had to do something with that material, and that's kind of how I approach my practice. I have kind of a visceral experience, and then I try to unpack it and understand what's happening to me and my lived experience, and so then I act upon it. So please go and see that show. They're basically 4 panels of this privacy control glass. They're 8x4 panels. There are 4 of them. So behind those panels are basically the last 4 chapters of the Quran. They're referred to as the khuls. And basically khul means saying in Arabic. And a lot of people all over the world are trained to memorize these khuls. And for me, I'm kind of a very lazy person. I mean, I just am, because there's a lot going on, so I try to take a shortcut on everything. So I learned the khuls because when you're praying 5 times a day, you have to learn at least 3 lines in the Quran to finish your prayer. And so I was all go to the back of the book, and learn all of these, surahs, chapters. And so but I think there's a lot going on here, right? So that's the joke part of it, to lighten it up. But also I found myself as I was growing up always referring to these khuls because they are forms of protection for you. So if I felt scared, or if I was happy but I wasn't sure about something, or I was really desiring something and I wanted something really bad, or I went into my first interview for my first salary paid job, which actually happened to be BRIC. So I remember reciting these khuls to myself when I actually met Elizabeth Ferrer for the first time in my interview in 2007 at Rotunda Gallery. Anyway, so all that to say is, in terms of identity, bringing it back to what Sara is unpacking, and what Kameelah is unpacking. So I think that there's a project that I've done. It's an I Am Muslima shoe, this shoe. So it's kind of a one-of-a-kind shoe because Nike, as a corporation, in their laws, basically considered putting the word Islam or Muslim on the Nike customizable shoe was going to incite violence. And so in around 2016, there was a huge boycott, and everything was a mess. But Nike actually has been in this situation so many times. So why am I referring to the Nike shoe as identity? Well, I think that the ideas around identity politics always seem to fall flat, and that's what we're unpacking here. But I believe that laws and policy are what create identity. It's what displaces people from their homes. It's what enables you to feel comfortable in wearing something like a shoe, like a Nike shoe. If you feel othered by that shoe, then you're going to start to feel some kind of way about other people wearing that shoe, and that's kind of a big part of what constructs identity. And so I actually think identity construction has so much to do with law and policy and very little to do with the inner community. And that's something that I would love to unpack as well.
Thank you, Baseera. Before we move on to Asif, I just want to sort of say that when you do visit Baseera's installation at BRIC, she was mentioning the double mirrored glass and that aspect of how she would see the imam and see herself sort of reflected. Mm-hmm. And that idea is obviously rooted in what we understand as double consciousness, and in particular, those of you that are familiar with the writing of W.E.B. Du Bois, the African-American sociologist. And within his very famous text, early 20th century text, The Souls of Black Folk, he, one of the core thesis of this set of essays is the sort of deconstruction of what is double consciousness, is how one's identity is informed by the other, which is always the case for many hyphenated identities, that they are sort of validated through the eyes of the other. In this case, it was the dominant discourse of the white male majority and how that informed his identity as an African man. But we can also see that sort of articulated into a way in which in terms of gender relations, in terms of sexualities as well, as sort of extends that discussion. And I think that's the sort of relevant one in terms of your work, Asif, in particular, because you're looking at also masculinities as well. I wouldn't say that your work is purely rooted in Islam or Islamic thinking, but it's definitely thinking about ways in which you yourself as a man, you articulate your position within this sort of social space, how you sort of navigate space, and how you draw from both personal history as well as public history in order to create your works. And you take two very specific works in the BRIC exhibition. You've produced a series of vests that are reminiscent of jerseys that basketball players wear, and but they're sort of like a uniform. They're uniformly color. They're also concrete color as well. They're made from a heavy felt. And the second set of works are entitled Threat Value, and these are a series of conceptual carpets. And I'd like you to sort of think about that and sort of within this frame speak a little bit about that idea of double consciousness, or also how you came about producing these works.
Yes. Let's see. Okay, I'll just start. Thank you, thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
I think Baseera started by talking about material, and specifically with these works, the carpet works, I was thinking about some of the material I engaged with when I was young, and the prayer rug or the traditional rug, specifically being on top of like a New York house or a house carpet rug, being wall-to-wall carpeting, synthetic rug, whereas a traditional rug or a prayer rug, which has devotional and historical value, made with different textiles, maybe that are like wool, dyed wool, natural dyed, and how I grew up with both of those rugs, many times one on top of the other one, and creating spaces of prayer, creating spaces of assembly or eating together or being together as a family. So many times, I use maybe a simple technique, and part of that is part of in the ideation or the meaning of the work. And here it was just a simple cut to continue the tradition of rug making and the storytelling of rugs. So with this one, it was an Afghan rug made in Pakistan. My family is from Pakistan, and I was born here and grew up with these two types of rugs. And the simple cut in one and the transfer of material to the other, and the transfer of material from that one back to the original. And that coming from genetics, being genetic recombination where two DNA strands overlap and trade material. So the action of exchange and transfer between these two materials comes from science, comes from biology, things I've studied, but also creates this sort of maybe hint at heritage, diaspora, further maybe colonization and war or other events that have happened in the past, and you can see that, I don't know, with the transfer of color and material. And then this other piece that also, I actually, you know, with this I wanted to also talk about the process, but more towards music, growing up with Punjabi music, Qawwali music, Nusrat Ali Fateh Khan, and thinking about something Arthur Jaffa had said about Pollock and how he kind of co-opted jazz music. With this, I wanted to, being inspired by music quite a bit, but also the structure of Punjabi music, or, you know, Qawwali music being the tabla being very geometric, being almost like a solid shape to me. The sitar being a fluid or a human flesh sort of sound. And then kind of the most important one, the drone filling in and being more gaseous. And those three states of elements helped me make many decisions in these pieces where the geometric shapes were the large carpets. The fabrics here are shirts, plaid shirts, those being sort of the fluid state of the sitar, and then the plaid being undone, and it's hard to see here, but in the middle, becoming quite unwieldy or having a lot of detail, being sort of a gaseous state. So in a roundabout way, talking about, you know, this double consciousness, I think it is this bleeding, or I would say less collision, more bleeding of like being inside a Muslim home, but outside having this American sort of culture and influence, but finding this need to go back to this original material and how that material is manipulated and how to manipulate it further in the sake of, or for the continuing the tradition of rug making and storytelling, which is quite historic. So yeah.
That's really interesting, the whole idea of interweaving ideas, which is inherent there, taking from biology, thinking about the cells and the sort of genetic formation, but then transferring that to the visual cultural realm. It's very fascinating. But there's something you said was really interesting about how you grappled with this duality of having from a Muslim home and then being American at the same time. And I mean, I'm not American, and here there seems to be such a focus, and forgive me for the generalization, of assimilation in this country. Whereas in Europe, it's more about, you know, your identity is fluid. It's not a sort of, it's frowned upon if you're not speaking in your mother tongue to your children, for example. It's actually seen as something positive to speak more than one language and to sort of embrace your otherness, which also has caused a lot of problems. If people think about what happened in Belgium and France, a lot of these countries argue that due to multiculturalism, or the rise of multiculturalism, there's been a sort of backlash. Often the 90s in particular are sort of perceived as a multicultural decade. This is before the advent of the internet. So somewhere between the Berlin Wall falling and then 9/11 happening, you know, that corridor, if you like, was sort of very interesting. It was a moment when there was, in the United States, there were exhibitions starting to sort of occur, like Thelma Golden, who coined the term post-Black Art, you know, in her Black Male show in particular, and the work that she did at the Studio Museum was sort of very much cognizant of this. But also in Europe as well, several exhibitions were sort of happening which gave autonomy to artists to sort of perceive their own identities, and it wasn't necessarily that idea of double consciousness anymore. They were sort of taking on their own, sort of staging their own exhibitions. There was more fluidity in terms of curators that were also knowledgeable and able to speak to the works and not necessarily, you know, box them in as well. So it was a very interesting moment. And then obviously now we reside in this sort of hyper surveillance period where, you know, social media and so forth play a very important role in sort of articulating our understanding. And obviously that is very positive, but at the same time it's had its very negative connotations as well. I mean, at the time of writing this essay, in particular approaching this project, the Muslim ban is still in place. You know, this exhibition largely responds to that. But its history is actually far more complex than that. It actually goes back to the 18th century, when in between like 1790, I believe, and 1944, that was a period that Muslim citizens could never be granted American citizenship. So, you know, the roots of this ban are very much more complex than what meets the eye. And, you know, it's instigated something within artists and cultural workers. It's, you know, it's a re-emergence of culture wars. Some of you might know this, some of you are quite young here, but culture wars is the term that sort of defined the era of, again, 80s and 90s, during the Reagan years and Bush Senior, in which there was sort of backlash against artists and cultural operators. And it was driven by a Christian fundamentalist sort of position. And several artists, you know, bared the brunt of this, even museums. Some of you might remember there was a show in 1998 at the Brooklyn Museum called Sensation, which included the work of Chris O'Feely, an artist who, when I was at university in Goldsmiths College in London, he had won the Turner Prize. There was an image of Madonna, as in Mary, with elephant dung. And Mayor Giuliani, Rudolph Giuliani, was the mayor at the time in New York, and he was outraged by this. And he cut the funding of the Brooklyn Museum and shuttered its doors. The Brooklyn Museum was closed for several days. He sort of demanded that this painting be removed. However, due to the Constitution, it sort of overrided that. And, you know, and art prevailed. But now, given what we're seeing under number 45, I'm not going to even grace him with the name, under 45, we're sort of seeing this reemergence again in this particular country. And, you know, I often say that when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. So we're seeing this sort of domino effect happening all over the world right now. This sort of attack on religious freedom, attack on the right to freedom of movement, in particular Brexit in the UK, here this impending wall, and how that's affecting artists. I mean, Islamophobia in particular, I mean, it's on the increase, but I don't think that that's necessarily one aspect that Muslim artists have to sort of challenge against. There are far more complex ideas regarding gender, regarding class, as I had mentioned earlier on, that sort of come into play here. So the issue of rights and belonging becomes really pertinent, and when we're making exhibitions and we're making art as well, we're writing about it, in particular within this current climate, and how artists play a very important role in sort of pushback. That, I mean, given my own practice as a curator, it's very artist-driven, artist-led. I work with living contemporary artists. So look to artists to sort of fill a lot of sort of gaps that exist within cultural sphere, and particularly with artists who are sort of from diverse cultural heritage. Their history is still very, very much new. You know, it's not the dominant discourse. It's still seen as a marginalized history, although we're trying very hard to sort of correct that. But it still seems to be a sort of pertinent issue when we think about belonging and sort of translate that idea, sort of transfer it to the white cube. Many of the ideas that are happening in our social sphere are also mimicked into what happens in museums and what happens in gallery spaces as well. And I wanted to sort of hear from our panelists today about how, you know, some of their experience have emerged. So Baseera, perhaps you can say something.
Well, okay. While you were talking and kind of unpacking the politics of this country, last weekend, Modi and Trump had a powwow in Texas. How many of you know that? Raise your hand high and proud. Exactly, everyone should be raising their hand, because it's basically, I'm going to say a few things that may not be very nice, and it's okay, because we don't have to always be nice. Modi is basically the cousin of Hitler. I'm not saying he is, because history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but history is always in harmony with itself. So the things that are happening right now are in harmony with, you know, a deep wound in the Western world, which is the Holocaust. And there are museums, there are tolerance museums built to not forget that moment in history, albeit it's happening everywhere. Like every president and prime minister that is hosting and managing every major country with infrastructure is really right-winged and Islamophobic and anti-Semitic right now. Like Austria, France, Italy, India, like everywhere, okay? And speaking of China, I actually went to get my coffee across the street today because I was feeling fancy. Usually I make my own coffee. You can save a lot of money when you do that. But I was feeling fancy, just got an award, holler.
Congratulations.
Okay, because you guys don't know anything about me based on my bio, but I just got a really fancy award. Anyway, so I was feeling fancy. I was going over to get my $5 coffee, and I get the New York Times, and on the front cover is like this redacted note transcription of Trump. And then you turn the page, and there's the international page, and it basically is this like huge article about how Muslims in China are exactly. And then Modi has been a perpetrator of genocidal activity of Muslims in India. And this isn't just like back in the day. This is like he got hired for the job when everyone knew that that was happening. And it's very interesting that he's being invited over here to have like a powwow with Trump in Texas. And the articles in the newspapers are saying, "Howdy Modi." Okay? And it's just very frustrating to even try to make artwork with all this noise, is what I'm trying to say. Because I'm a material girl. You should see my work. It's beautiful. Like, I make rugs from scratch. I make huge glass panels that are super austere and very like poetic and knowledgeable. And like I'm working on this big show coming up soon. And I'm just like, I always think about material first. But I wake up every morning to the news, to this, like, I am not wanted here, but I have no other place to go. And so that's usually like about 35% of my brain power is going to like, I'm stepping into this room, who's looking at me like I shouldn't be here. I'm sitting on this panel, who's looking at me like I shouldn't be here. Like it's unconscious too. So it's hard, it's just hard to decipher how to even think about my work because that's most of the noise that's going on in my head.
It's really interesting you raise that point because you take a global sort of phenomena and then you sort of bring it back to American soil. And with this sort of meeting point in Texas between Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, and 45.
I think India is one of the largest democracies in the world.
So to speak, as a socialist, yes, but with what's happened with the right wing, I beg to differ. Kameelah, perhaps, we had a conversation, a brief one yesterday about this, and I was sort of saying that I wanted to sort of demystify the them and us sort of problematic. And you said to me, Sara, it's really difficult to sort of do that when we think about African American histories, and you sort of mentioned to me that it's very much rooted in the American experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think as like a grounding point for me, I often find conversations about Muslim and Islamic identity to be like deeply frustrating because there's often a complete erasure of like Black Muslims who have innovated and had been in Islam, been in America for centuries. And oftentimes when we talk about Muslim artists and Islamic artists, there is a deferral to artists from the Middle East, artists from North Africa, artists from South Asia. And then if there is space, there's a conversation with Black Muslims to ask us what we think about something, if we are even considered in those conversations. And so for me, I think a lot of timelines around what we think about Muslims and Muslim artists and things of that nature always start at 9/11, as if that was the only point at which like folks existed or at the only point at which surveillance existed. But if you think about the deep histories of like Black folks as descendants of enslaved people in this country, we've been undergoing surveillance since we got here. And so these conversations that are now sort of evolving and sort of these inclusions and conversations and activities are often frustrating for me, because there's often this question of like, what took everyone so long to get to this place that we've been at as Black Muslims for quite some time, and our understanding of like the racial and class politics of this country. And so for me, there isn't a sense of like being like frustrated with the current state of affairs, not because they're not frustrating, but because they have been a given lived experience for Black folks in America before Trump, after Trump, and far before any of these moments. And so this sense of making sense of my practice as an American or something else, there's not a making sense of my practice in that case. Like, we built the shit that we're on. So there's no sense of feeling departure from American identity. For me, there's more of a sense of like, what does it mean that we only talk about Muslim identity in contrast to American identity? Because again, it's an erasure of indigenous people, it's an erasure of Black people, it's an erasure of tons of people. So in my practice, I'm really sort of thinking about how we make sense of nuances of histories and how we don't create these very, very convenient and problematic plot lines, which don't actually start at where people are, but sort of superimpose the hierarchies that exist. And I think it's just sort of a good point to just mention that as frequently as we talk about like the S&M or like the people against the Muslims, within Muslim communities, there's deep classism, there's deep racism, there's deep divisions, there are deep problems, and oftentimes there's sort of like a positioning of us outwards to say like, look what people are doing to us, which is an important conversation to have, but we don't actually deal with the terrible things that we do to one another because we actually can't deal with racism. Like, there are places my husband and I cannot go to pray because we do not feel comfortable. And so before I even get into these conversations of where, if I belong in this space, it's like I should be able to go into my Muslim community and feel at home. And I actually, there's tons of subway posters that are up for this show, and I met a man, and he says, oh, you're that Kameelah Janan Rasheed, and I said, yeah, and he's like, oh, Assalamu alaikum, blah, blah, and he looks at me, he's like, oh, are you Muslim? And this is the question I constantly get every single day, are you Muslim? I'm like, nah, I just wear this for like kicks, like what, I don't, like I don't get it. And so there's a double erasure that happens in the context of like, who is Muslim, who can ever be a victim of Islamophobic action, who is considered a convert or a revert, who is knowledgeable enough to speak about Islam, who is included in this cosmology of who is who. And I think that that is a complicated conversation that I think never happens because we become so focused on thinking about everyone else because we don't want to actually deal with our mess, which is that we replicate and actually like innovate on some of the deep racism that is often directed at us.
That is a fascinating and a very important point that you made, and it's unfortunately very true. Like Judaism as well, you know, you have the Ashkenazi and Sephardic meaning the Middle Eastern Jew, and Ashkenazi from Europe. There's also a lot of racism that resides within that, but that is a huge problem within Islam as well, about the sort of divisions. Going beyond the Sunni and Shia, which is like your Catholic and Protestant, there are much more other complex issues. But it's interesting you say that because my grandparents were Iranian Marxist intellectuals. My parents were socialists. In the 60s, they were at university in London, and there were three things that they used to always talk about. There was, firstly, to get rid of the Shah of Iran, that he had to go. The second thing was the civil rights of African American and indigenous people in the United States. And the third one was the liberation of Palestine. And that was really sort of key to the formation of what then became the Iranian Revolution, because it wasn't articulated by Islamicists, it was articulated by intellectuals, sociologists, economists, and so forth, political scientists, except they were all sort of done away with after the revolution happened. But it was really interesting because Iran was also one of the first countries to put Malcolm X as an official stamp as well. So I always find this discussion really interesting, and being Persian, we're not Arab, we're something else. We're not Sunni Muslims, we're Shiite Muslim majority, or we're other. So it's often this sort of chasm that we have to deal with as well. But you're right, Lisa, you're right when it comes to sort of issues of belonging, that somehow sort of, and this is very pertinent to this country. I would say that it's less in Europe, where Islam is sort of seen as a brotherhood, where people of all races are sort of embraced. Whereas here, unfortunately, it's the color line, and it hasn't shifted in centuries.
Just at the risk of, like, I don't like generalizations because they don't do anything for us, and I think in response to that, I would say that that issue of color exceeds the Atlantic. Like, that's an issue everywhere. I don't think that's a particularly United States issue, right? And I think that like we do ourselves a bit of a disservice when we sort of presume that like in other places they're doing it right. And even in the case of like the Malcolm X stamp, there is sort of this tendency to go towards like the optics or the symbols or the things that like represent affinity or like allegiance or allyship without actually doing the work that goes with actually supporting and being alongside communities. So I think like pushing us to look beyond like we have a person in our group who represents a group and therefore we've done our work to actually think about the power dynamics, like who actually gets to speak about Islam, who actually gets to be involved in making decisions, who actually is invited to speak about anything related to Islam. And I think that we have to push ourselves beyond the optics and the representational politics to say, what are the power dynamics between Muslims within Islamic communities?
Yeah, well, that's a relevant issue, and that's something that needs to sort of shift in itself. And there's a lot of work that's happening on that as well. But just in terms of, just to clarify what you said about the racial lines, it's a class divide in Europe, it's a class divide in England. It's not based purely on race, it's something else, you know, and there they sort of realize that you exceed in society based on your class, not on your color. I mean, obviously race plays a huge, huge role, but here there is another, I mean, I'm not American, so I've only been here a few years, and I keep saying that my observations as as an outsider are, I'm still grappling with this issue. I mean, that people will see the color of my skin, or when they hear me speak, they don't realize, they turn around that this person is a person of color because of the way I speak, the way I sort of go about that. And then there's this sort of shift in change, or they'll say, oh, I didn't realize, are you French? I said, no, I'm Iranian. And obviously everything, it becomes about Iran then, and everything sort of, the sort of tone changes completely when they realize, but you have a British accent. And I find that the most bizarre thing to say. But these are just based on ridiculous sort of ignorance as well, and which unfortunately we all have to face. And I've faced it from so-called very educated elite in this country as well, and right down to somebody who doesn't really fit that either, the other opposite of the spectrum. But that's an issue. And coming back to the art world, which is what our sort of cosmos is, there seems to be a lot of work that has happened, you know, sort of dissolve that. But it's this idea of positive discrimination. I mean, I have my juries out on that, whether I think that's a good thing or not. I mean, in some cases I think it's an excellent thing, given sort of complex histories, but also another point, I mean, it's dubious. You know, as Kameelah said, the work needs to be done, the work should speak for itself. And I think I wanted to hear from Asif, because you've been the most silent at our panel this evening, a little bit more about this issue. You know, Islam is like, okay, I'm going to say it, it's a fragmented jigsaw puzzle. Mm-hmm. You know, when the West sees it, they see it as a full picture, a stereotypic picture. But when you're in it, you know that it's fragmented. You know that all the pieces don't somehow fit. I mean, I'm not knowledgeable to speak about Islam at all. You know, I'm not at all. So I think that just in terms of thinking about our positionality, how do you feel about this?
I guess my some major experiences are political ones, and the first one being the Gulf War. And before the Gulf War, no one knowing what Pakistan is, or maybe even what a Muslim was. I was in high school in North Jersey, you know. So and not having any representation in the cultural or any sort of mainstream or any sort of visualization of what a Muslim or South Asian would be in the media. So you came across on Fox or on news channels as a political body, you know, it's one that's surveilled and a lot of the footage not even being from the U.S. or maybe from mosques and even ones I was going to in North Jersey in Teaneck. So that was just like the beginning, and then of course 9/11, where it was a complete politicization of identity, you know, and that being your identity, that in every media outlet, you know. So not even the culture or the heritage or any sort of practice coming across, but it was more about the visual being political, you know, or the body being political. That's how that's how it, to me, was being portrayed primarily through media and in a lot of ways during that period. So that sort of fragmentation was, that's how I'll kind of respond to that. It was like one fragment of the identity coming through.
To your point, to what Kameelah said earlier when she said that this issue of surveillance is rooted in deep-seated history, it's true, you know, surveillance of Muslim people became more prevalent for outside Arab, the sort of issue of the non-indigenous Muslim of the land, you know, so it was based on immigrant people who came here either through education or through even second generation who'd been somehow brainwashed, and that they had taken on a fundamentalist identity. But the issue of surveillance is far more back. If we think about politicized images, they are rooted in our sort of visual cultural conscience. Images from the 1960s and even earlier as well of Muslim bodies, which, to Kameelah's point, were African American bodies as well, that included those. So there is that sort of mirror there that one has to sort of look at the two. Things became sort of hyperbolic or hyper-visual after 9/11, but even before then, you know, some of you might be familiar with Edward Said, the popular intellectual of Palestinian Lebanese origin. Edward Said wrote the book Orientalism, How the West Sees the East. Prior to that, just after the Iranian Revolution, he wrote a book called Covering Islam, which speaks to what you're saying. It was sort of looking at the Iranian Revolution as this point that Iran was a great friend of America and it all went sour after the revolution happened, and then the hostage crisis happened when scores of Iranian student youth stormed the American embassy. And they took hostage because they wanted the Shah, the king of Iran, to be returned to be tried in Iran for his war, for his crimes against the Iranian people. In any case, there would be images of showing they'd be like fanatical Muslims, sort of, so to speak, you know, show them sort of protesting in the streets. They were actually protesting for democracy, not for Islam. And then they would immediately cut the image to show wholesome American children playing in a park. You know, so there would always be this sort of ridiculous juxtaposition, which isn't new. And I totally agree with what Kameelah said, that this is a sort of a re-emergence of history sort of repeating itself, but this has been happening for centuries. That this has been, and not just within Islamic histories, but also in indigenous histories as well, this sort of erosion, and there's a sense of amnesia here as well. And so sometimes, you know, as Deborah had mentioned, that I did my PhD in London, I focused on Soviet Orientalism. And what that was one East looking at another East. So I was thinking about Central Asia, Iran, and Caucasus region, how it looked to Russia to define itself during the Cold War years. It didn't look to Europe and North America. So I was always sort of cognizant of this idea of East looking at East, which, if we sort of bring it here to this sort of, to this site, is exactly precisely what she's saying, is that there is a severe lack of this, or severe acknowledgement of one other looking at the other, because there are so many sort of different layers of fragmentation and otherness that are not just rooted in the color line, they're, you know, much more complex than that do need to be addressed. And I think that with this exhibition, as sort of complicated as it was, there was that sort of multiplicity. And today when I was listening to Kameelah's installation and opening here, so those of you who haven't heard it, please go and listen to it. It was an immersive experience, and it made me laugh. It made me sort of remember things about my own childhood growing up in London, but also about this idea of multiplicity, which is really at the core of her practice and also at the core of the exhibition and the artists on this panel today. So I want you, Kameelah, to just sort of speak through, because the idea of this jigsaw is kind of similar to how you were sort of collaging these ideas, or if you like, bricolage, because bricolage is like taking two disparate ideas to create a new idea.
I don't know if I would use the comparison of a jigsaw, because the idea is that then that becomes something complete and coherent, which I don't think that...
Fragmented jigsaw, maybe.
Yeah, I don't think that I'm working towards like coherency or linearity in that way, but I think in thinking about the show, I've pulled a lot from my upbringing and from my parents and thinking about the actual construction of the work. So my parents both grew up Christian. They converted to Islam in the early 1980s. And as my dad was learning Arabic and learning Islam, he used to photocopy these books, and he would cut out pieces of the Quran and then cut out a piece of another book. And he was learning to deliver khutbahs at the time, and it was basically typing. And so he used to create these like very layered pieces of work on the back of his pharmacy school notes. He was in pharmacy school at the time, that would have like, oh, assalamu alaikum, welcome to the khutbah, and it would also have these notes about prayer. It would have all these annotations. And so in thinking about the work, I was really excited to sort of come back to his work, because I think that the way that he was making sense of Islam was sort of pulling from all these different elements of things that he was reading and making sense of, and adding annotations and then sort of asking questions. And I think that in constructing the work and thinking about my own practice, one of the things that I feel like my parents sort of ingrained in me as part of like Islamic practice, but also just part of like being a human in the world, is sort of this idea of questioning or responding to text. And so even before I knew what annotation was a deep part of how we sort of engaged with. We wrote in all of our books. Every single book that we have, as I look back at it, is deeply annotated. Every Quran that we have is deeply annotated. Every book that my dad ever had, he had his name, his phone number at the time, when he got the book, and then a bunch of notes about the whole process for getting the book and then engaging with the book. And so for me, I was really interested in creating work that sort of nodded to this process of annotation and redaction, and thinking about text not as something passive that you accept because someone gave it to you, but something that you sort of like interact with. An important part, this mic is not great for me, an important part in my practice is sort of thinking through opportunities to be responsive, and thinking about engagement with text as sort of like a necessity or an imperative. Like, it's unethical for me not to respond to a text. It's unethical for me to allow it to be passive and not to be engaged with. And so sort of in creating the works, it was me dealing with lots of pieces of text and lots of pieces of collage, and sort of thinking through collage as a way to think about the impossibility of both certainty and the impossibility of like coherence. Those pieces don't come together, shapes don't fully fulfill themselves, things leak out of the frame, and there are things that are not in frames as well. And so I'm really interested in those moments of sort of leakage or sort of spilling out of parameters that have been established but can't hold the thing at which it's supposed to be holding.
Thank you, Kameelah. And I think that is fascinating in terms of your conceptually driven practice, but that's also in terms of what you're doing, Baseera, and Asif as well. I'm aware of the time that we started an hour ago. I'm going to sort of do one question more, then we're going to sort of tighten everything up and open it up to the floor for at least 10, 15 minutes of conversation with you all, is the idea of learning and unlearning, which is really important as well. When we learn, we must also unlearn certain set ways of thinking. And this idea of all three of you have undertaken teaching here. So you're all teaching sort of the next generation of artists, curators, cultural practitioners. So you're playing a hand in sort of curricula as well, curriculum building in the United States in terms of arts. And I wanted to sort of just ask you, I mean, Kameelah, you just sort of articulated that through your practice and the way in which you sort of interweave. You use a practice that looks at collaging, drawn from personal and sort of professional elements. But just Baseera and Asif, I just want to sort of ask you about what role does smuggling play into your teaching? And I don't mean something illicit when I say that. I don't mean anything against the law. What I mean is, how do you slip in these sort of elements of how you want to sort of shape visual culture? Because of course a teacher is, a very important position in terms of, you're shaping minds, future minds. How do you sort of smuggle in a little bit, not just how your students could be a bit more woke, but just more about the whole idea of anti-ignorance, perhaps, or just knowledgeable, or thinking about sort of some of these ideas we've discussed today?
Well, I'm only 5 classes in to my teaching career, but I have been smuggling a bit, I guess. I'm teaching video at New School it's my first class ever, but it's a representation of different artists and their practices, and how, it's not centered on certain type of person or anything, but it's more about showing different facets of culture, American culture, different types of visual culture, but also how they problem solve and how they uncover within their own culture or within their own practice. And I'm very kind of enamored by that, not just like making images, but like putting your own body at risk. The performative practice, I also engage with performance, and I put that idea a lot, I use that phrase a lot even within my own ethos, is putting the body at risk. And I'd like to see that either in different practices, and I think that comes across, especially now, with different artists representing, underrepresented areas of visual culture, So a lot of the photographers and filmmakers and artists I show, engage with some risk or some deep uncovering to literally have people notice or really pay attention. And I think that is unfortunately a necessity right now. I don't maybe need to smuggle, but put it right at the front, and champion it.
Thank you. Baseera?
I was just trying to recall an artist who's showing at Essex Gallery in the Lower East Side right now. It's an archive exhibition, and just in terms of smuggling, it's a great example. So there was like a Carl Andre piece at this exhibition at the Tate, and this was something like in the 60s, I believe, or maybe it was later. No, I'm sorry, it wasn't the 60s. It was in early 2000s. And so in this exhibition, it's an archival exhibition, this artist takes her pram, her baby cart with her baby in it, into the Tate, and drives on top of the Carl Andre piece. It's a floor piece. And she just keeps going up and down this piece. So, okay, I'm an artist and I'm teaching in schools. I've been doing it for a while. Education's huge in my family, blah, blah, blah. It's just that, how do I teach a significant concrete poet in my sculpture and performance classes? I don't want to teach him. So instead of teaching him, I show these kinds of works because it unpacks the problematics of this hyper-masculinized figure in American canon artwork. And so I'm able to talk about him and talk about triggers without saying triggers. And then I can fast forward and talk about Anna Mendieta, who is a really amazing artist who was purportedly pushed out of a window by Carl Andre, right? So this is kind of a way that I smuggle information into my classrooms. I have a lot of fun with my students. The other thing that I do is I make my students do a lot more work for me than I actually do for them. Again, I'm like somebody who takes shortcuts. I mean, my minimum of teaching is way higher than most of my colleagues, so I know I'm giving my students a lot. It's just that I think it's important for them to perform, because the way that art school is right now, first of all, I'm always an adjunct. I'm not going to be a permanent staple in your children's education. I'm basically a Mary Poppins. I come in with an umbrella and I come down to the school that basically some white cis male messed up. Can I say a bad word? Some white cis male fucked up and said something really rude to a black or brown female professor, and then he went on sabbatical. So he's still getting paid. He's just on sabbatical. Anyway, so this is what happens, and then they're like, who can we talk to? Who can come and cover up? Who would look good optically? And so then they call Baseera Khan. That's how I became a professor. So I don't know how to unpack that, other than the fact that I know that I'm already going in as somebody who's trying to clean up a big mess. And so because of that, and because of the nature of art school not being consistent, because you don't have consistency with professors, you don't have consistency with your colleagues, everything's really fragmented. We're talking about fragmentation. I mean, art school itself is fragmented. So I make my students do presentations and have them tell me where they are and what kind of work they're into, what kind of work they're proud of, and I always ask them to tell me their side hustle. And I ask them to tell me their side hustle because the things that they love to do, they never really recognize in their own practice. Because the art canon, as we know it, is super oppressive, and it's really contrived and categorized and westernized. And so usually when they're like really into like baking cake, then I try to get them to make sculptures about the thing that they love to do. And so that's kind of how we unpack things. I teach them Fanon, I teach them, you know, like Sylvia Wintour, whatever, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's like, it's all good in the end, I think.
Thank you, Baseera. Did you solve the problems of the school when they hired you?
Usually it's funny because like there's
hiring Obama was supposed to solve all the problems.
Right now I'm teaching at Bennington College, and they ask you for bio and an image, and they like upload you, and everyone's super excited. And so I have recently been like debuting in corporate photography. So like Kameelah and I were actually talking about like me scapegoating Dove that approached me because they liked my hair and they had a new hair product. So they were like, we're doing this thing on artists in New York, female, that are like legacies, and we want to have you do this commercial. And I was like, okay, well, what are you gonna pay me? And they were like, we'll pay you $700. And I was like, you mean $700 an hour? And they were like, no, $700 period. And I was like, no way, there's no way I'm doing this for $700. And so, but also I wasn't going to do anything with Dove because Dove has been like historically pretty racist. Anyway, I had done this project with Surface Magazine, and I took this ridiculous photograph with Louis Vuitton, and I basically sent Bennington College that fashion photo where I look super ornery and totally ridiculous because I'm kind of fed up with being the like patchwork girl in education. It's tiring, and it's actually kind of abusive because you're always the person who's trying to correct a problem, so I'm not a resident psychologist. So, I mean, I know that you want me to tell you about like my passion of education, but like I am usually asked to be a psychologist on campus, and it's very frustrating. So
I think we all can speak to some experience like that, but just to sort of say, I know that we're very short on time now, is that I want to open up to questions, but just to sort of summarize our discussion today, that we were thinking about augmenting plurality, difference, thinking about not just double consciousness, but in some cases triple consciousness as well, when we think about seeing ourselves through the other and then the other seeing us. So therefore it sort of expands that conversation, thinking about decolonial inquiries, crisis in thinking, reverting back to histories as well, and thinking about the work that sort of needs to be done. I wanted to sort of bring it back to the art school because, you know, it's another form of institution that we've been sort of solely focusing the conversation on the sort of art realm, White Cube Museum, how we could sort of think about that within the kind of space of discussion and dialogue. But enough from us. I'd like to hear from you. Any questions, comments? Don't be shy. Wait for the mic, please, though.
I'm glad I came, and I want to thank my friend Lenora. I'm an artist. I'm in theater and journalism. My first question is what's your name, please?
Asif.
Asif. Right, Asif. My first question is to you. I've been all over the Middle East, in Asia, etc. I work for the United Nations, and I've seen the carpets being made. I'm hugely fascinated by, even in the souk in places like Morocco, where people are pushing these wheelbarrows with the scraps and old rugs and what have you. I'm looking at this piece here, and we will walk down to the BRIC tomorrow. And I'm looking at this piece with the rug in it, and I want to ask you, when you're doing your work and you're moving one, to the other, is there any link? Because we're talking about the complexity of identities, and we have all these grandparents and, on either side of anyone that is, I don't know how to put it, linked to the rug, it is in the rug, is because I am seeing something and feeling something from the piece of art that's this particular piece of art, and even the other one with the colors and the stuff.
Yeah.
Right, and then, so hold that thought. And for Kameelah, are you a Muslim? What do you mean by that? That would be my question, you know, because I get questions about who I am, and when people ask me, I put it back at them and say, are you Jewish? Or something like that. And the double mirror identity of Sara. Sara, what goes through your mind, and do you take it to bed sometimes and jump up when you see that mirror where you are looking back at you, the glass, not really a mirror per se, but where your reflections looking back at you, a you that you're seeing that you don't see every day. And the men on the other side looking at themselves, perhaps looking at you, that you intertwined, it seems, within your art, which I can't wait to see. What madness, you know, when you lay down, when you put your head down, do you experience with that identity? And my question for the moderator is, I grew up in the UK, and you just said something about, in England it used to be, at least when I was growing up, you know, the bloody West Indian or the damn French or Irish, because nobody's like the English per se, and so on. So, and there was a little bit of race, there's a lot of race thing, even though we don't call that, because I played Mary, Queen of Scots. You know, so that's, I'm an actress, I can play Mary, Queen of Scots. But you said something which I'd like you to kind of explain when you say indigenous Muslim. What do you mean by indigenous Muslim? Because there's Arab states, and they all have names. You get my meaning, and people are Muslims, whether they're here or they're there. So could you kind of explain what you mean by indigenous Muslim? Thank you.
Well, I was referring to the argument that we were discussing earlier about that Islam is so tied to Middle East, but it's a migratory religion. It's sort of, indigenous would be from the birthplace of the Prophet, from Saudi Arabia, which was called Hijaz, that region, historically. That would be sort of indigenous. But given the fact that it's such a migratory religion, it's a complex and a fraught term. I mean, I'm Persian. We became Muslim when the Arabs conquered us. We weren't Muslim before. We were all Zoroastrians before. And so we were the last to be converted to Islam through the Arab conquest. So and that's around 8th century when that happened. And Islam had already established itself elsewhere. And so through that idea, often, I mean, I've been sort of referred to that you're not a real Muslim, you know, your people are, you know, you're Persian, you're not Arab, but then that whole complex dialogue becomes really, really, really sort of simplistic. It oversimplifies Islam, number one. And so that was sort of my take on that, when I was trying to sort of argue against it. Questions?
Okay, so what I can talk about is the question about indigenousness. So there's a thing that kind of went off in my brain a couple of years ago where I was like, okay, so if I'm only going to be seen as a Muslim artist or whatever that means, albeit a contemporary artist, well, a lot of my experiences are based on, you know, having this faith and growing up in this faith, but then also all these other ways of being, subcultures, main cultures, being American. So actually, like, Muslims that are in America have a very particular way of being, and Muslims have particular ways of being with regards to the places where they are from. And so I've been thinking about the idea of being a Muslim American native or a native Muslim American. or like trying to like use those three words in the right order somehow. But there is a way that I am a Muslim here in the US that absolutely is not the experience of someone just like me in India or Pakistan or Nigeria or China or wherever. And it's due to the fact that we have television, we have cable, we have like homogenized milk, we have like all kinds of different things in this country, and that influences the culture, and therefore it influences the religion and the way in which people engage with that religion. So that's kind of how I can speak to the indigenous side of that. And then in terms of madness, yeah, I'm crazy. Anyone who knows me well knows that I'm crazy.
Yeah, so actually,
Keep it brief.
these are not rugs in Turkey. They're quite, this one is made out of synthetic American-made rugs and plaid shirts. And yeah, that's quite perceptive. If you didn't know this series of work, it's storytelling or around personal story like event where the plaid shirts are taken from an unidentified person who killed my father when I was 20. So the idea of red plaid being variable, or like any multitude of red plaid, and that identifying this person. So in this piece, there's 4 types of red plaid, and I keep using red plaid in a lot of work, and pulling it apart or weaving it into these type of rugs. This being a very cheap rug, but blessing maybe American rugs or these type of rugs with the storytelling or the information that are in the sort of traditional rugs I grew up with. So yeah, that's in a series, a large project called RAF. So yeah, that's the person in there.
I have a question for Kameelah regarding, I just want to know what your opinion is on whether or not you think it's the responsibility for I guess for people of color, but specifically as a Black Muslim woman, but if you think you have a responsibility to educate people on your lived experience. I really responded to what you said about being like the token Black Muslim, especially in many different scenarios, and how you kind of respond to when someone who does not look like you kind of tries to parallel their own experience with what you're trying to say, and how you respond to indirect or blatant racism even by people that also identify as Muslim. I wanted to know how you respond to that, whether or not that manifests into your work, and when you choose to say something and when you don't.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think I said a couple of times 2 of my least favorite things are generalizations and analogies, just because I don't think they do service to analysis. And I think particularly with analogies exist because we want to find a sense of commonality so that we can communicate something legibly. So like, this thing that I experienced is just like this, or it's also like this, or that also happened to me. There's a desire to bring in a moment of commonality so there's a sense of connection, which I think is an important thing to do. It's an important intention to have. I think the danger is the erasure of historical nuance in doing exactly that. And so it's not so much that I desire for a lack of commonality. I desire for us to all do the rigorous work of being in community with each other and accepting that even though we can all be Muslims, we can also have very distinct histories that make our positionality and subjectivity in the world very different, which means we're dealing with different things. So when we all make sujood and all pray, we are all praying, but at the same time, we may be praying for different things based upon our positionality. We may have to have made certain decisions about where we can pray that day based on our positionality. There are other questions that we're contending with. And so I don't think it's my responsibility to educate other people. It's very interesting to me because I feel like Islam is, I felt very grateful that my parents found Islam, and I feel like people have all types of stories around like their parents converting and things like that. And for me, Islam is very scientific in that it gives a very clear sort of heuristic or pedagogical approach for making sense and learning about the world. Your imperative is to read, and your imperative is to make sense of the world, and your imperative is to be curious, and your imperative is to revise and accept when you are wrong about something. And so for me, I don't go into the world saying I'm going to educate this person or that person. I do say that I would like to build community with other people, and in that process of building community, then we build a relationship where that becomes the basis for collective learning, right? I think there are a lot of times where people who are outside of the scope of what is considered traditional or popular or consumable Islamic or Muslim identity are asked then to perform. And I think that creates a sense of resentment and also creates a sense of just like dehumanization, in that they're not part of a community but are just there for the optics of being present to talk about something. So I really think that authentically building community with one another means that we actually have to accept the problems within Muslim communities to say, like, actually, yeah, my husband tells me the story. He went to go pray somewhere in Brooklyn, and I won't say the masjid that he went to, but he was praying, and someone brought a chair and put it next to him and made it very difficult for him to pray. And he should be able to walk it anywhere. But the reality is that if you appear Black and Muslim, there are some communities that you cannot walk into. And so I would like to live in a world where that doesn't happen, but particularly within Muslim communities, I would like to live in a context where if that happens, then people are actually down to have a conversation about what that means and what responsibilities we have to one another. We are always taught to be one ummah, but I think that becomes the parroting that actually displaces or makes people move away from conversations, because to have a conversation about this means that we're not one happy ummah. But I actually think that you become an ummah when you actually contend with the fact that some of y'all are racist. Like, that's just like it's a thing, and it sucks, and it feels terrible.
I think we'll have one more question, then we'll wish you all good night. Come on. Do you have your hand? No more. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to Asif, Kameelah, and Baseera, and all of you.